The regime did not collapse in a courtroom. It shattered on blood-soaked ground. How did the monopoly on violence end? Not with an international tribunal, but with street justice in the dirt. By 2011, Muammar Gaddafi had controlled Libya for over 40 years. He survived global blockades. He crushed military uprisings. Then the institutional framework evaporated. The power transfer bypassed all legal protocols. It became purely physiological. An enraged mob surrounded the absolute ruler. Ingrained dust and fresh blood coated the dictator's face. Citizens dragged his body through municipal drainage pipes. 40 years of systematic social conditioning dissolved into raw, animalistic retaliation directly on a dirt road. State authority turned into physical trauma. But this terminal phase required a trigger. The physiological disintegration began exactly 9 months before the dirt road. Protesters breached police lines and occupied the streets on February 15th. The regime's collapse on February 15th did not stem from abstract geopolitical shifts. It ignited at a standard police precinct with the detention of a single attorney, Fathi Terbil. Relatives of political prisoners converged on the concrete lot. They stood shoulder to shoulder. They gripped printed lists of names. In their hands, they carried faded paper photographs of murdered inmates. Across the asphalt stood state security personnel in full tactical gear. The crowd raised crumpled sheets of paper, demanding Terbil's immediate release. They pressed the documents directly against the heavily armed police line. The friction was purely local. Terbil did not incite a regional revolution. He simply represented the disappeared. Hours before his arrest, he had publicly exposed the classified data of 1996. He targeted Abu Salim Prison, the state's primary isolation facility. The government documented the 1996 incident as a contained riot. The forensic reality contradicted the official protocol. Eradicating 1,200 inmates is not a standard penitentiary lockdown. It represents the logistical scale and casualty rate of a full military offensive, executed entirely behind concrete walls. Security forces fired heavy machine guns and fragmentation grenades directly into the crowded prison courtyards. The operation generated 1,200 corpses in less than 3 hours. The regime answered the grieving Abu Salim families with lead. On February 17th, military snipers took positions on the rooftops of Benghazi. State forces eliminated 230 people in the first 4 days. What was the social protocol for crowd control? Live rounds fired exclusively into the chest and head. The day of rage mobilized thousands. The unarmed crowd roared below. Then came the sound. The dry crack of combat rifles cut through the noise of the streets. Internal security agency units ignored tear gas and riot shields. They executed standard military clearing protocols against their own population. Marksmen calibrated their optical sights from the concrete edges of residential blocks. They locked onto human targets. They pulled the triggers. Medical staff documented the aftermath. Hospital intake logs recorded precise wound ballistics. High-velocity projectiles shattered ribs and obliterated skulls. 230 dead civilians in 96 hours equals the casualty rate of an infantry battalion in intense urban combat. It was the mechanical destruction of society. State television maintained the blockade on reality. Broadcasters blamed foreign agents and hallucinogenic drugs. Then the programming shifted. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi faced the camera. The dictator's son bypassed political negotiations and directly promised a civil war with rivers of blood. The state's primary argument fit inside a rifle chamber, 7.62 millimeters. The officers pulling the triggers defended a very specific structural model. They protected the Jamahiriya framework. It had been processing Libyan society into obedient material since 1969. A 27-year-old commander seized the state apparatus. He dismantled the monarchy. He expelled foreign military bases. Then he nationalized the entire oil infrastructure. The administration centralized all hydrocarbon revenue streams. Society lost complete economic independence. Every citizen relied strictly on government distribution channels. The official doctrine proclaimed the absolute power of the masses. The functional reality delivered the exact opposite. The Jamahiriya system operated as a rigid, singular autocracy. No political parties, no independent media. The regime monopolized both capital and truth. External operations mirrored internal surveillance. The leadership financed global armed factions. In 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 detonated over Lockerbie. 270 civilians died. The geopolitical blowback hit the state machinery. But the structural damage fell entirely on the population. The resulting international blockade isolated the society for a full decade. Flight routes closed. Import chains collapsed. Millions of citizens became trapped hostages inside their own borders. By the early 2000s, the administration recalibrated its parameters. The dictator dismantled his chemical weapons programs. Diplomatic channels with Western governments reopened. Foreign corporations returned to the oil fields. The state upgraded its international facade, but the domestic suppression protocols remained fully active. The social surface appeared perfectly stable. That surface stability shattered when the 40-year architecture of fear finally failed. By late February, the 36th Brigade rejected direct fire missions against civilians. How does a state apparatus process the command to exterminate its own population? Officers hijack combat aircraft, refusing to strike urban centers. Major General Suleiman Mahmoud ordered his units to stand down. Troops turned their weapons against loyalist forces. The institutional contract ruptured. The chain reaction dismantled eastern military districts. Protesters breached army depots. They extracted assault rifles. Security compounds burned to the foundation. By the 24th of February, eastern territories dropped off the regime's grid. Air Force pilots received flight coordinates to bomb Benghazi. They diverted their fighter jets to Malta instead. This specific defection neutralized the regime's operational monopoly over Libyan airspace. The dictator lost the sky. The load-bearing pillars of the state collapsed inward. Deserting officers and civilian leaders merged into a unified command structure. On the 27th of February, they activated the National Transitional Council. Former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil took control. The objective shifted from localized riots to total regime replacement. The dictator broadcasted a final ultimatum. He promised rivers of blood. The threat backfired. It accelerated mass military desertions, forced the rebel council to draft a new governance system, and triggered the exact conditions for international military intervention. International strikes dismantled the military infrastructure, but the screens remained active. Despite United Nations Resolution 1973, state television maintained a continuous signal. How do you hold a fracturing country together? Through total propaganda and the promise to cleanse every street. The broadcasts transmitted directly into silent, unlit living rooms across the country. The dictator classified the opposition using two specific terms: rats and traitors. Static interference periodically interrupted the video feed. Outside those domestic spaces, empty streets amplified a different frequency. The heavy acoustic boom of Russian-made surface-to-air missiles tore through the airspace. The media division projected absolute control from an isolated studio. But the physical defense perimeter failed to intercept NATO aircraft. The psychological operation completely contradicted the tactical reality. By mid-2011, the operational map inverted. Supply routes disintegrated. Ammunition depots burned out. The capital lost its structural buffer zones. Rebel formations descended from the western mountains and pushed directly toward the city limits. The so-called rats targeted by state television broadcasts already faced systemic carpet bombardments by early March. While propagandists projected a sterile narrative of order, the elite Hamis Brigade pushed heavy armor directly into the dense residential sectors of Benghazi. Main battle tanks breached neighborhood perimeters. Steel tracks crushed civilian vehicles. High explosive rounds shattered apartment facades. Unarmed crowds scattered in blind panic. Benghazi housed over 600,000 residents. The second largest urban center of the country became a designated free fire zone. Further south, Ajdabiya sustained identical structural damage. The air over the collapsed blocks choked with the sharp smell of cordite and pulverized concrete dust. The regime lacked reliable domestic infantry to clear the rubble. They outsourced the suppression. The government broadcasted endless statements about defending national sovereignty from outside interference. In reality, the state imported foreign mercenaries from Chad and Mali to execute Libyan citizens. Hired contractors mounted heavy machine guns on pickup trucks. They fired armor-piercing rounds directly into living grids. The state apparatus morphed into a transnational extermination mechanism. Deploying mechanized units against domestic populations triggered immediate geopolitical protocols. Regional tolerance collapsed. The Arab League submitted a formal request for airspace restriction. Diplomatic machinery accelerated in Paris and London. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council convened. The delegates adopted Resolution 1973. The legal framework authorized all necessary measures to intercept the regime's military assets. It established a strict no-fly zone to shield the remaining population. The electronic board displayed the final tally. 10 member states voted in favor and 5 abstained. The political resolution translated into immediate military action on March 19th. What is the price of a no-fly zone? The total erasure of radars, air defenses, and communication grids in a matter of days. Operation Odyssey Dawn began at sea. Guided missile destroyers aligned in the Mediterranean. Target coordinates locked. Vertical launch systems opened. The deafening roar of jet engines tore through the night sky. Exhaust flames illuminated the dark water. 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles. They launched in a single operation. Each unit cost over $1.5 million. The coalition spent more than $165 million on the first volley alone. The warheads struck their designated targets. Radar arrays exploded on impact. Early warning networks failed instantly. Ground crews found their air bases paralyzed. Munitions detonated inside reinforced bunkers. Decades of imported weapons burned on the tarmac. Shrapnel shredded the fuselages of MiG-23 interceptors. Sukhoi bombers burned out before pilots could start the engines. The technological gap left the local army defenseless against an invisible enemy. On March 23rd, the command structure changed. The mission shifted. NATO assumed absolute control under Operation Unified Protector. The air campaign grounded the Air Force. The naval blockades severed the supply lines. Frigates and destroyers established a tight perimeter along the coastline. Radar operators tracked every approaching vessel, while heavily armed boarding teams inspected cargo holds for smuggled munitions. The regime lost its resupply routes. The dictator could no longer arm his remaining loyalists. The total number of NATO countries enforcing the maritime isolation reached 28. As the maritime blockade sealed the northern coast, the ruling family shifted to ground escape routes. The state apparatus dissolved into empty safehouses. Discarded documents and hurried packing marked the abandoned rooms. By August 19 or 20, the dictator vanished. He abandoned the capital. He left his frontline units without command. The regime degraded to stealth movements in the dark. A family that built a 40-year military machine did not use regular army convoys to flee. They relied on illegal tribal networks. The escape route went south. The border with Algeria cuts through deep desert terrain. State border guards do not control this sand. Tuareg tribes dictate the passage. The elite traded state power for smuggler trails. Heavy off-road vehicles disappeared into the dunes. On August 29, the convoy breached the Algerian border. The dictator's wife, Safia Farkash, sat inside. His daughter Aisha and his sons Hannibal and Mohammed crossed the line with her. Algeria granted them temporary sanctuary. The absolute power fragmented. Another son, Saadi Gaddafi, headed further south. Niger authorities detained him. By August 20, 2011, Operation Mermaid Dawn initiated the capture of the capital. What remained of the 40-year center of power? The outer perimeter of Bab al-Azizia stood completely without defenders. Only scattered luxury items and abandoned documents littered the internal vaults. The assault relied on internal subversion. Covert units bypassed military checkpoints weeks prior. They cached assault rifles inside residential blocks. At 0 hour, the local population of Tajura and Fashlim synchronized with the advance guard. Ordinary citizens actively absorbed the covert strike teams, permanently altering the tactical balance of the capital. Armed civilians neutralized loyalist firing points. The loyalists fled. Urban combat saturated the grid. Heavy machine gun fire. The distinct crack of breaking concrete walls echoed across the fortified sectors. Loyalist armor and sniper units lost spatial control within hours. Soldiers dropped their weapons. They abandoned designated coordinates. The defense grid collapsed. On August 23rd, the breach finalized. Rebel infantry overran Bab al-Azizia. 6 square kilometers of command bunkers fell to the militia. The concrete microcosm of state power dissolved completely. Assault teams swept the underground tunnels. They kicked open the primary blast doors. Nobody was inside. By September 2011, the perimeter insert collapsed. Muammar Gaddafi began dropping weight rapidly. Severe hypertension attacks struck him daily. The bunker lacked clean water and essential medicine. How long can 200 men survive without antibiotics and clean water? Physiology takes its toll. Without daily pharmaceutical intervention, mild diabetes and high blood pressure trigger a chain reaction. Extreme stress accelerates the biochemical cascade. The human body enters an irreversible process of physiological exhaustion within weeks. His physical decay mirrored the structural collapse of the entire defense grid. The dictator's face turned pale and hollow. An untrimmed, stark white beard covered his jaw. This sudden growth served as a precise biological marker of lost control. The pristine television image died in the dust. Medical logistics ceased to exist. Medics treated shattered limbs using basic mechanics tools. They operated directly on filthy concrete floors. No iodine, no anesthetics. Men absorbed the shock of amputations without painkillers. Disease and dehydration hollowed out the remaining combat unit. Exactly 200 fighters maintained the final inner ring. Abu Bakr Yunus Jabir, the veteran defense minister, commanded this isolated cell. They consumed expired dry rations and drank contaminated water from broken pipes. The command structure degraded into basic survival mechanics. Retreat protocols vanished. Gaddafi rejected all extraction plans and refused to leave the country. To conceal this physical collapse from NATO aviation, the isolated unit enforced absolute radio silence. The contrast was absolute. Months prior, state television broadcasted his daily speeches. Now, avoiding every camera and lens became the only survival tactic. Survival required rigid bunker mechanics. The claustrophobic space dictated the routine. Fighters operated on strict sleep shifts. Half stood guard, half slept in the dirt. To blind the drone optics overhead, they manually sealed the perimeter. Men hauled heavy sandbags and dragged massive concrete debris across the doorways. The sheer physical weight of the barricades broke their already exhausted bodies. They buried their remaining vehicles under solid rubble. Zero thermal emissions, zero radio traffic. A single electronic signature guaranteed a laser-guided strike. The strategic map shrank rapidly after the fall of Tripoli. Gaddafi formulated one final extraction operation. The target coordinate was the city of Sabha. From that central desert hub, the convoy could push toward the border with Niger. Former government officials had already crossed that line weeks prior. But the rebel infantry secured the sector first. Opposing forces physically barricaded all escape routes to the southern deserts. Infantry physically severed the southern desert routes. The vertical escape route closed next. By late September, rebel forces locked the perimeter. How do you coordinate a defense under the lenses of thermal imagers? The command transmitted orders exclusively through foot couriers. The air vibrated. A constant low-frequency hum of NATO planes hung over the ruins. MQ-9 Reaper drones circled at 20,000 feet. Their optical sensors penetrated the smoke. Their thermal imagers tracked infrared radiation. A human body registers at 37 degrees Celsius. The sensors detected these heat signatures right through thin concrete roofs. Any electronic emission guaranteed an immediate missile strike. The technological gap dictated survival. The inner circle carried Thuraya satellite phones. They kept the batteries removed. They feared turning them on even for a single second. Radio silence was absolute. Muammar Gaddafi commanded the inner perimeter. He coordinated the remaining loyalist pockets using pure biological logistics. He used human runners. A courier gripped a folded paper message. He waited for the aerial drone hum to shift. He sprinted across a shattered alleyway. He dove through the blown-out window of an abandoned house. Dust masked his tracks. He crawled through the rubble to deliver the tactical update. Below the scanning grid, the National Transitional Council infantry advanced block by block. Soldiers fought primitive close-quarters engagements. Snipers locked down the intersections. The urban terrain neutralized armor advantages and spiked the attrition rate. The brutal street battles claimed the lives of over 1,000 fighters. The routes used by Muammar's couriers faced methodical erasure. Artillery of the National Transitional Council ground the asphalt into dust. Thousands of fighters from various brigades converged to wipe a single city off the map. Units from Misrata and Zintan locked the perimeter. The destruction started at the street level. Loyalists rigged major intersections with improvised explosives. Anti-tank mines choked the primary supply routes. The defensive grid swallowed the civilian sector entirely. Snipers occupied school rooftops. Gunners operated heavy weapons directly inside hospital courtyards. Ordinary family homes transformed into concrete death traps. Trapped residents absorbed the crossfire. There was no escape. Then, the macro-level bombardment commenced. The attackers unleashed unguided area of effect munitions on the urban center. Crews fired 122mm rockets from Grad launch systems directly into the most densely populated residential zones. This concentrated kinetic impact guaranteed the total destruction of load-bearing structures and underground communications. Tank batteries leveled the outer perimeters block by block. NATO strike aircraft dismantled the deep command bunkers from above. The habitat vaporized. Holding any fixed position became physically impossible. The city infrastructure finally collapsed. The structural collapse eliminated more than a tactical stronghold. It buried a macro-political project. Gaddafi had engineered Sirte as the future capital of the United States of Africa. Wide modern government avenues now sat choked with shattered concrete. Loyalists seeded the intersections with anti-personnel mines. The planned utopia became an urban crypt. The command structure fractured. Saadi Gaddafi evacuated across the border to Niger. The leader retreated to his origins. He relied entirely on local fighters from the Qaddafi tribe. His political heir, Saif al-Islam, shifted daily between regional safehouses to avoid detection. The central power dissolved. 450 kilometers of hostile desert permanently severed Sirte from the lost Tripoli. Supply networks failed. The physical perimeter closed tight. Sirte lost all physical transit routes to the rest of Libyan territory. The perimeter lock was absolute. By October 19, the surviving command initiated a mechanical breakout. Can you hide 50 heavy vehicles from aerial reconnaissance? The tactical group bet on complete darkness and dead headlights. The operation required strict light discipline. Guards dragged wooden crates of ammunition across the shattered concrete. Mechanics bolted heavy anti-aircraft machine guns onto the beds of civilian pickup trucks. No flashlights, no electrical circuits. The crew loaded the hardware entirely by touch. Security Chief Mansour Dow managed the boarding. Guards, aides, and the remaining command staff packed tightly into the cabins and cargo beds. Dozens of diesel engines ignited simultaneously. The low, continuous rumble of idling cylinders vibrated through the ruined streetscape. 50 vehicles formed a single column. Even with all external lights disabled, the formation stretched for half a kilometer. Above the broken city, NATO operators deployed airborne reconnaissance drones equipped with advanced forward-looking infrared cameras. The analytical reality left no options. Against high-resolution thermal imaging, a half-kilometer chain of hot engine blocks transformed into a massive, glowing target. The designated extraction route went southwest. The navigation coordinates bypassed the main roads, aiming straight toward the Wadi Zamzam Valley. At 8 in the evening, the lead pickup shifted into gear and accelerated into the open desert.